Hello everybody, and it is I, Brian the Pirate, and once again, I have a build guide video for you. Please excuse the get-up. It's Christmas Eve when I'm filming this, and I thought it only appropriate to wear the gifts that friends and community members had got me. Besides, fear is the mind killer. Anyway, on with the show. So, Titan Grenadier. It's a very comfy build. Very, very comfy build. It's I suppose this is a disclaimer. It's a build that feels a little bit different to play. And I mean this for grenades in general, not just specifically the Titan Grenadier build, but the grenades playstyle is very alien to what many of you will be used to, where you just move, click, explode, kill, everything. You're constantly firing off abilities. You're constantly doing things. Whereas with grenades, you tend to be drop grenades, run, do a bit of herding, an explosion occurs, and then you continue. And when you get used to that, and especially when you have explosive shot integrated, so you can kind of trigger the grenades on the time that you want them to be triggered, it does feel a lot smoother. But that very early leveling experience, like the first, well, until you get explosive shot, basically, it can feel a little bit like, oh, and there's a lot of running around waiting for things to explode. But like I said, once you get explosive shot, it becomes a lot smoother. And then when you're into the end game, actually the long fuse times and stuff actually play quite well into the playstyle. And you find that you end up dropping grenades, moving on to where you're about to go, you fire a shot off and you clear that, and it ends up forming this loop that ends up making the playstyle quite smooth. But yeah, so that's just something to consider. The build is otherwise very, very comfy to play. You're quite tanky because you've got some armor, you've got some evasion, you've maxed out your resistances, and you're just running through things, lobbing grenades everywhere, and it's quite fun to play. Is it the biggest deeps on the planet? No, but that's not what this is about. This is about making a fun build to play. It's definitely got good deeps, or DPS if you're not familiar with that word. It's definitely got good DPS. Like most bosses, you can basically drop a bunch of grenades down, flashbang them, the grenades all go off, and then you do that maybe 2 or 3 times, and you will probably kill the vast majority of bosses. One notable boss that's quite hard to stun, or 2 technically, the Colossus, or the Titan, and Torgal, the big fire-breathing skeleton dude that you see in Act 2. For some reason, they're just really resistant to stun, so it's pretty much better off to just unload everything on them and bring down the health bar. But anything else can usually be stunned with 1 round of flash grenades. And then you have a bunch of explosive grenades. You trigger them with explosive shot while they're stunned. And a lot of the time that takes off at least a third, more often than not half. In some cases, depending on the tier of the map, all of their health bar. So at the moment, I'm wearing pretty mediocre gear. There are 2 uniques that I recommend for this build, especially for the way that I've played it. Do you absolutely need them? No. But I'll explain why they're good, and then you can make the choice on whether or not you want them. One of them in particular, I think, is essential-ish. And the other one is more of a quality of life thing. These are my statistics at the moment, or my stats. As you can see, I'm basically capped on everything. Not quite on the lightning, because I made a slight change. I need to replace 1 piece of gear. I'm looking for an upgrade on my belt where I have 2 charm slots, or 2 additional charm slots, so I can have 3. That's just to make things, just that quality of life a little bit better. But otherwise, I'm capped on everything. I actually have 78 potential, 78 for lightning. The chaos I could use a little bit more of, but I do have the chaos charm, which kind of makes up a little bit for that. Ideally, what you would want is resistances on everything, and then maybe you could have the chaos soul cores instead of the chipotle ones, as I call them. But let's just go over the gear. So the weapon, this is the one thing that you're going to really want to min-max on. This is almost where I want it to be. I would like it to be a little bit different. So this is a all fire build. You use Avatar of Fire, which I'll show you later in the video. That means that you don't do any other damage other than fire, and your physical damage gets converted to fire. So having lots of physical damage on your weapon is quite advantageous, or having fire damage on the weapon is quite advantageous as well. Now, usually with attack-based skills, you don't actually want plus skills. That's usually a weak stat. So in this case, +6 to all projectile skills. And that's because attack skills, usually the damage increase is quite incremental because it's scaling off your weapon in the first place. Explosive shot, on the other hand, is an exception to this rule. It goes up by like 20% each time it has a level. So in this case, you actually do want as much levels to projectiles, 7 being the cap, as possible. Ideally, if this was the perfect bow, it would also have plus elemental damage to attacks in as large a number as possible. And that would just make my damage utterly disgusting. So yeah, basically lots of fizz damage or fire damage, plus the levels and elemental damage percentage. Everything else can be what you want. You're probably going to want some strength and or dex on there. And that's because of the helmet, which I'll show you now. So Solus Ipse, I believe it's pronounced. I think that's Latin for not alone, and that will make sense in a moment. This helmet, you can use 2 copies of the same support gem in different skills. Now, that's very, very important. It's also very familiar probably to some of you. It's kind of a skill that the Gemling Legionnaire has, but you can get this on a helmet. Now, getting this means equipment and skill gems have a 25% increased attribute requirement. Now, obviously that means that all of these things like this helmet says it needs 46 strength and 46 dex and 46 int. That of course is a lie. It doesn't, unfortunately, when you equip it, update those values. So it's all actually a lot more than that, and it will be likewise for the rest of the gear and your gem skills, which is why I mentioned you might potentially want strength and or dex or both on your bow for suffixes, just to help make sure that you can attain gem levels and the means to wear the gear that you want to wear. Now, ideally, you're going to want 2 sockets corrupted. I think it's a div, 1 div for this, or 1 dong if you prefer. Make sure it's got quality on it, of course. Try and corrupt it yourself. If you do, make sure it's obviously got a socket in it already to get the second. And then you want to put the plus to chaos. Likewise for the gloves, you're going to want plus 2 sockets into it. 20%. I've gone with Thingy of Chipotle at the moment. Again, if I had perfect elemental res on my gear, I would have probably just gone with the 2 chaos ones instead. Back to that in a moment. But this helmet is magic. You can use 2 copies of the same support gem in different skills. Now, to clarify, for those of you who haven't played the Gemling Legionnaire, that means you can use 2 gems multiple times. So 2 payloads, 2 scatter shots, 2 fire infusions, 2 fire pen, like loads of them. It's not just 1 gem that you can use twice and it's just that 1 gem or whatever the first gem is. You can use multiple gems twice, which is really, really nice. It's very potent. Very, very potent. It also means it's really easy to pick the things you want because you just pick all the powerful things again. The next item is Aris Veins Wings Burnished Gauntlets. Now this isn't necessarily something you need, but it's a bit nice. And the reason it's a bit nice is because of the Decimating Strike. Again, you might recognize this from one of the Merc Ascendancies. Decimating Strike hits against full life enemies, remove between 5 and 30% of life before the damage of the hit is applied. Now, the idea of this build, my thought with this build initially was to try and just one-shot everything. And I could certainly do that with rares. Some bosses, again, it depends on the map tier and which boss that I'm fighting. And that helps facilitate that. Because you can imagine you throw anything. It could be the flash grenade. It could be the explosive grenade. It can literally just hit him and not explode. And suddenly 30% of their life just disappears already. So that just makes things substantially easier. So that's pretty much the only reason I've got these. Again, you don't necessarily need them, but having that 5 to 30%, especially if it's in the higher tiers where they've got massive health, it's just fun to see, if anything. And of course, it helps facilitate doing lots of damage really, really quickly. The amulet is something else that I want to slightly change. This has an implicit of 28 maximum energy shield. I would prefer if that was I believe it's a solar amulet that gives spirit instead. What that would mean is I could get clarity in my my auras, which would increase my mana regeneration, which is quite important for this build because the mana costs of everything are gargantuan. But we'll come to that in a bit. With regards to the rest of the gear, it's you've got some options. Obviously, you want to get res. Get res on everything. That should be obvious. That's pretty much every build. That's 99% of builds in the game. You shouldn't need to be told that you need res on everything. So get res so you res count. Get life so you have all the life on the planet. You can either go with armor and evasion, which is what I've done, or you can go all in on armor if you prefer. It's entirely up to you. If you're really bad at dodging things or not getting stuck in mobs, probably go for all the armor. Whereas evasion, it means that you can hang out on the sides and any projectiles that come at you, most hopefully miss because of the evasion. And then if anything does manage to hit you, the armor mitigates it enough anyway. Then you've got the belt. The belt, I would prefer to have the 2 charm slot affix. I'm in the process of crafting my own belt. A little bit more lightning res would be nice. That's why it's not quite capped. I actually got rid of being capped originally so I could have that additional charm slot. Ideally, you would want 35 or, yeah, as much cold as possible and a little bit more lightning. But again, it depends on what resistances you have with the rest of your gear. Boots, movement speed is king. Always have movement speed. Resistances, everything else is pretty obvious. High defensives if you want more mana. Mana on everything would probably be nice as well because of the cost of the skills. But otherwise, life, defenses, resistances, very, very obvious stuff. Likewise for your rings, getting some physical damage on there or fire damage is going to be nice because it scales with your attacks. Likewise on the other ring, it's otherwise lots of fizz, lots of resistances. On this one, I've got physical attack damage as mana. That doesn't work. That was when I was leveling. I was still, before I applied Avatar of Fire, where I still had actual physical damage to use for mana leech. But that otherwise doesn't work. Ideally, I can't remember if you can get it on rings, but mana on kill would be nice just for map sustain, so you're not having to use your flask as often. And that's the gist of the gear. Basically, the important thing is this: getting a godly bow, maybe having that for the poops and giggles because it's nice, and then defense and life on everything else. I also have this shield. This is aesthetic. This is pure aesthetic. It is pure aesthetic. I just want to confirm it's only because of this guy here. He is majestic. He runs around with me. I call him Bob. He comes with me wherever I go, and that's it. That's the only reason I have this guy. Now, technically, if you are unlike me and relatively sane, you would probably want a decent shield, at least with some defenses, some block on it and things like that. Not because you're going to have it out all the time, but because you've got shield charge and leap slam just for a bit of mobility if you want to get around the maps a bit quicker. And if you get caught out with some monsters around you, at least you've got some additional defenses. Otherwise, I just like carrying Bob around, and that is literally the only reason I actually have the shield. Now, the passive skill tree is very spread out. It goes all over the place. There's a fair bit of travel, but it's worth it. We'll go over the ascendancies first, though. This is why I picked the Titan. Eventually, I intend on getting my 4th ascendancy. I was actually in the middle of doing it, and then the game crashed when I was near the end, and it just closed the trial. And I was doing ultimatum, and I thought I could do this. This is fine. I got close to the end, and then it bricked it, and I got really salty, and I haven't gone back to it. But otherwise, what you want is crushing impacts. Your hits are crushing blows. What does that mean? It means crushing blows cause a heavy stun on enemies that are primed for stun. What does primed for stun mean? Primed for stun means when you get them to about 80% or 90% or 95%, if I remember rightly, for rares and uniques, it means that you don't have to do lots and lots of stun damage. If you hit someone who's primed to stun, it will go, okay, here's the rest. They are now stunned. So it just gets stuns a lot quicker, a lot sooner. Then you have surprising strength. Surprising strength is 40% more damage against heavy stunned enemies. That's 40% more, multiplicative. So when they're stunned, they take all the damage, which is literally the only reason I picked this build, because flash grenades pretty much guarantee the stun, and then suddenly they're taking 40% more damage, which is huge. After that, you want colossal capacity. Why? Because you need it to get to hulking form. It is nice. It's very quality of life. One thing I would point out, items that are in here kind of are a bit sketch. By that, I mean when you go to Dariani to identify all of your inventory, anything in here doesn't get identified. Some consumables, when you control click them to go into your stash, don't, whereas others do. So that's a work in progress, I assume. Also, when you get it, it initially looks like this. So don't forget that you have it. Otherwise, you forever will be carrying just these ghostly items that you're completely unaware of in this little satchel. It's also a little bit annoying when you're in the Atlas because it tends to cover up the box for putting in your waystones as well. That is what that does. A few more inventory slots. Then hulking form. 50% increased effect of small passive skills. This is going to be huge. Absolutely huge, because you have a lot of small passive skills that give you like really good benefits, like these increased armor. You're going to have increased effect. Eventually I'll be getting that one as well. You've got area of effect, you've got ignite, penetration, things like that, additional attributes. It scales massively. Big dick stuff. This is stuff that you want. I haven't got it yet, but I imagine because I've got these, technically it will give me a 30%, because 50% of one is obviously 0.5. So I'm guessing if you add those up, this is speculation on my part, but I'm guessing if you added the 0.5s up, you would get the third percentage. So you'd actually be on 79 for your resistances, which is chef's kiss. You definitely want that. Let's go through things. The order that you apply these, I've put it on the max roll planner, the order that I think you should do them in. That isn't necessarily the order I did it in as I was leveling, because obviously I was trying to work it out as I went along. But for now, I'll just cover what the notables mean, what attribute nodes you should do. On mine, I've basically done what I need to equip my gear. So I've got enough int to equip the helmet, because that's the only thing that should have int on it, enough dex to equip my gear and equip my gems. And then once you've got enough to do all of that, everything else is strength for life, of course. Now, as I mentioned before, you don't actually know what the true values are because it doesn't update them with this helmet on. So everything else that you see, like here, 86 strength, 86 dex, adds 25% onto that. And then you'll be able to work it out. Likewise for your gems. So when it comes to the attribute nodes, do what you have to do to get your gear. Everything else strength. We've got this, increased armor, regen life, plus 10 strength. Pretty obvious. Armor good, life good. Jobs are good. And next, we have got increased area of attack and area of effect. Obviously, very, very good. Attack damage and area effect, both very, very good. All of your attacks are area of effect. Backup plan. More armor, more evasion if and when you have been hit, or if you have not been hit. This cluster is just really, really tasty. Primarily, you got overwhelmed. Reduces your attack speed a little bit. Not too big a deal because you just rely on dropping lots of nades rather than fire them over and over again anyway. And that's pretty much based on the reload speed, if anything. Stun buildup, huge. Weapon damage with two-handed weapons. Crossbows, I'm going to point this out because it's not necessarily obvious. Crossbows are classed in the passive tree as two-handed weapons. I've made sure of that. Usually, if it doesn't say two-handed or something explicit to the text, it doesn't work. But crossbows do count as two-handed weapons. So just so you feel really reassured there. Increased accuracy. Honestly, I don't know if I need that one. I'm very tempted to spec out of it because I think technically the area of effect attacks hit anyway. I think the only thing you actually need accuracy on, because if you do go to the, for example, if we go to explosive grenade and bring that out, it does say that it has a chance to hit. But I think that literally means the projectile, because it can do damage. It can bonk them on the head before exploding and do a little bit of damage. But obviously that's pittance. It doesn't really matter. So I'm not actually sure if you actually need accuracy. It's there just in case. I need to do more testing with and without it, because I've pretty much had high chance to hit anyway, so it's been very difficult to tell. Maybe someone else has confirmed it elsewhere in the community. And then increased area of effective attacks, plus 10 strength. Pretty obvious. This one, you want 50% increased grenade fuse duration, because grenade skills fire an additional projectile. More projectiles equals more explosions equals more death. Then you've got grenade skills have +1 cooldown use, so you can just spam them more frequently. Then you want all of the wheel, because it gives you cooldown recovery, which means that you can fire them more often. My gems need some work. I've gone with fire damage, chance to ignite, area effect, totem placement, because that was what was on the gem, or the jewel rather. Then we come down here. Grenades have a 15% chance to activate a second time. That's just really, really tasty. It synergizes with payload, which makes them activate a second time as well. Then we come down here for polymathy, which is increased attributes. I think that's pretty obvious based on that helmet that we've got. It just means that we can attain the attributes easier. Then over here, we have 20% increased area of effect for attacks, increased cooldown recovery rate for authority. Then we got over here, everything you're going to do is fire damage, which you'll see in a moment. So you got smoke inhalation, which is fire penetration, and increased with duration on fire elements. Then we've got fire pen, and then we've got some chance to ignite and chance versus burning enemies. Ignites are pretty consistent with this build, so you don't have to worry too much about it. Then we come over here. We have got increased armor, 50% of base armor from equipment, also added to stun threshold. Very, very tasty. Lots of armor means less damage taken from physical stuff, which is most things. Defend with 200% armor against critical hits, plus 15 strength. Again, really, really nice. We've gotten all of the nodes here because just lots of armor, and again, that will synergize very well with hulking form. Then we come down here. We have got singular purpose, reduced attack speed. Again, not too big a deal because in exchange we get stun buildup and that 40% increased damage with two-handed weapons. Then we come over to Avatar of Fire. So 75% of damage converted to fire damage. The trade-off is deal no non-fire damage. And you might be thinking, but that's only 75% of my damage, Brian. However, all the skills you use convert some of the damage to fire already. So this just converts the rest of it. So you're still actually doing 100% of the damage. You're not losing out on any damage. So you don't have to worry about that. As long as I mentioned earlier, the weapon has only physical and fire damage on it. If it has lightning or cold, that will just disappear. It will mean nothing. So make sure you don't have any fire or cold damage on your weapon. Then because of that, we've gone up here to get all the stun build-up and pen. Hits with heavy stun inflict fire exposure. So again, it's just a guaranteed fire exposure, which reduces their resistances to fire. Chance to ignite, damage against ignited enemies. And then we've got a really tasty cluster here, which is +1 to all maximum elemental resistances, +5 to all resistances, and the 2 that come off it in each direction likewise makes that to go even higher. Then there's what's left. Now I'm level 84. As I mentioned, I want to get at least another one there. The rest of your points can go in a number of places. My plan is probably going to be to get these 25% increased attack damage, 25% increased attack damage. Likewise, the little mini nodes, again, they will all scale with this. And then probably over here to Sigil of Fire, increased damage with hits against ignited, and Burning Nature, 25% increased fire damage. That all hinges on how I do in later maps when I start building up and juicing up the bosses even more with like the +1 to bosses, etc. At the moment, damage is fine, so I may not need it, and I'd probably rather invest in more defenses. In that case, you've got some nodes over here that you could probably utilize, 80% increased armor and evasion rating while on low life. There's actually a very interesting node around here somewhere. I haven't tested it yet, but I'm very interested to see if it works. 100% of strength requirements from boots, gloves, and helmets also add to armor. I don't know if that's including the 25%. If it is, that's like another 200 armor with my current gear. If it's not, it's about 150, so it might still be worth it. Like 150 flat armor is kind of nice. Like it's the equivalent of having another piece of equipment, essentially. So considering that one, again, I'll have to test it and see just how beneficial it is. You get some extra life regen or armor as well, depending on which way you go. And again, that will likewise synergize with that. Otherwise, as I said, if you're going the evasion and armor route, there's some nodes over here. I believe there are some towards the bottom of the tree as well, +1 evasion rating per 1 armor on equipped gloves, and likewise gain 8% of evasion rating as extra armor. They could be quite beneficial as well. As I said, that's going to depend on like if I need it or not. Let's go over the skills now. So the skills, we have the first few skills are the important ones. So you've got explosive grenade and flash grenade. Also, you'll have explosive shot, which really should technically be higher up. So let's just swap those around just for the sake of aesthetic. So these are the vast majority of the build. The rest is kind of filler. And again, I'll explain a bit more what I mean by that in a moment. But primarily, what you're going to be doing is, say you're coming across a bunch of rares or particularly tough blues, you drop a bunch of explosive grenades first, then you drop the flash, and then they tend to all go off together. It stuns them, and then the explosive grenades just take them out. That is going to be 90% of your rare, magic, and boss gameplay. For general map clear, flashbang. Flashbang is enough. And I don't just mean that to be really supportive of flashbang or flash grenade. It is actually enough. I think, I could be wrong, but I think what's happening is when you use flash grenade, I think the stun technically applies before the damage, and it's almost guaranteed to stun everything ever, which means it benefits immediately from that 40% increased, 40% more damage from your Ascendancy. So despite the fact that I actually lose damage from Scattershot and have no like damage increases to the actual flashbang grenade, it just clears. It in a lot of cases, I've literally killed rares and blues in tier 13s. I'm about to start tier 14s with just flash grenade. It's done it on its own, and I've not had to whip out the explosive grenades. White mobs, it certainly kills everything. And if anything is really, really tanky, like a hulking or colossus-like skeleton, bulky golem things, I usually just finish them off with a quick explosive shot anyway, because they only have like 5 HP left or whatever. Explosive grenade. Followed by Ingenuity. Spot skills have 30% increased cooldown recovery. You're going to need that because you have payload. Spot skills have 70% reduced cooldown recovery. However, grenades fired by support skills have a 50% chance to activate a second time. That, as I mentioned, synergized with the node that we used before. That added another 15% to that, which means the vast majority of the time, your grenades do explode twice and not just once, which will happen there. There we go. So there, you got 2 loads there. Next, we have Primal Armament. So this is supported skills do 25% more weapon elemental damage. This works because of Avatar of Fire. technically, the vast majority of your damage on your weapon is physical, but Avatar of Fire converts it to fire. So that's why this adds basically, at the moment, for my build, 1,000 damage, I believe, 3753, 4690. So yeah, it adds a huge chunk of damage. Then we've got Scatter Shot, which we will be using twice, for those of you who are a bit more observant. We've got Scatter Shot here, because more nades, they overlap pretty well, so you're hitting the boss a lot more times. This is primarily for bossing. For the 6th slot, what did I put? It's in my doobry. I went with Fire Infusion, which is another 25% extra fire damage. So for the 6th slot, when you get your perfect jewelers, Fire Infusion. Flash Grenade, Scatter Shot, guarantees the stun because they're getting hit by multiple grenades. Overpower, increased stun buildup, just to definitely guarantee that stun. Ignition, and the reason we want Ignition, this is more for clear, so it adds chance to ignite, and then enemies that die whilst ignited explode afterwards. And it just, again, helps with clear. So again, if anything does somehow manage to survive the initial the blinding, then the corpse explodes and murders them anyway. Explosive Shot, it's not really utilized for anything. It's literally just a trigger. So the fuse time on your explosive grenades is quite long, and then you'd set them off with Explosive Shot. It's literally just to make things explode when you want them to, so you don't have to wait for them. It's really nice. It's sometimes that you can use it as a finisher, as I mentioned before. Say something just has a smidgen of health left. As you're running away, you can just take a pot shot at it and murder it. The rest of the attack skills, I'll cover those first, are not necessary. However, if, like me, you occasionally don't read what a map does and just run into it like a psychopath, every now and then you'll run into a map that has 50% less cooldown recovery, which means your skills can take a long ass time to recover, because grenade skills, they can take a while. When that happens, you want to fill in the gaps. You've dropped a few flashbangs, you've dropped a few explosive grenades, and now they're both on cooldown. So you've got some oil grenades, which also helps with a bit of crowd control as well. So oil grenades, they cover things in oil, including mobs, which slows them down by 20%. And it can apply fire exposure, which means that they have 20% less resistances. The slows are quite nice, like I said, for like just general mitigating how close they can get to or how fast they can get to you, especially if you have a map where you've accidentally increased the attack speed and movement speed of all of them. So that's pretty nice. And it can ignite really, really easily. So you've got Strip Away, which increases the effect of the exposure built into oil grenades. Ingenuity, just so you can cast it more often. And then again, Fiery Death, so anything that it does kill is basically going to explode afterwards, and it helps with clear. Cluster grenades, these were originally what I was going to use until I realized flashbang just kills everything. So cluster grenades, again, they're more of a filler. They do have a wide area of effect, so they can be quite nice, but otherwise you're going to be fine with flash. But cluster grenades, they drop a bunch of grenades which have a small initial explosion, and then they drop more grenades that likewise have small explosions. So for that, I've gone with Fire Infusion, which is going to add extra fire damage. As I said, you'll be able to use these twice because you've got that helm, so the other Fire Infusion would be there. Fast Forward, that just is less skill effects, so they trigger sooner rather than later. And then Elemental Focus to add 25% elemental damage. And then Primal Armament, again, just a bit more weapon damage because it scales all of the fire damage. No idea what the 6th one should be. I wouldn't prioritize this to even have a 4th slot. If you've got the spare greater and then eventually perfect and you really want to min-max, sure. But otherwise, focus on these two and getting these to, well, at least this one to 6. Otherwise, yeah, these aren't that particularly important. Overwhelming Presence, on the other hand, is lovely because it means that things can get stunned a lot easier. They can ignite a lot easier. So you definitely want that. I've got Cannibalism, so after you kill things, you recover life. Eventually, I would want Clarity in it. I need a amulet first. That gives me the plus 10 to 15 spirit, and then I can just whack Clarity in there for better mana generation. And then we've got Wind Dancer. So for me, I am using Evasion, so I'm using Wind Dancer. If you went all in on armor, you might want to look at maybe a different type of aura, maybe, I don't know, Arctic Armor or something. It's entirely up to you, but I wanted extra evasion and then whacked in blind. So if anything does hit me, it gets blinded, so it's less likely to hit me again. And some vitality, regenerate 1% of life per second with support skill active. So I always have at least 1% regen. As I said, otherwise you got shield charge and leap slam. That's more for mobility. They're not really used for anything. I've whacked in Holy Descent, so if I do jump onto a mantle that I couldn't get to initially, I land, I put Consecrated Ground, which heals you a wee bit, and suddenly monster, oh no, it's okay. And then I just swap to my bow anyway and murder things. Discombobulate, very similar thing. It just gives them daze, which gives you a little bit more survivability. That's pretty much only if you get caught out. In the vast majority of instances, it's only being used when I'm backtracking somewhere. I'm like, oh, I could get to the boss quicker if I jump up there. That sort of thing. Likewise for shield charge, I've given it second wind just so if I'm backtracking, I can just pop it twice quickly to cover the distance quicker. That is the skills. I also mentioned mana. Explosive Grenade uses 126 mana. That's at level 17 with the +6. Obviously, it's going to be a lot more eventually. I don't know if it actually gives you... so actually, it's 153. If we go down there, it's 153. So that's with the multipliers. Flashbang is 140. The cluster grenades are 181. Oil grenades is 122. It is all very expensive. Even the explosive shot is 117. And that's with level 17 gems. I have room to grow, and so do the mana costs. So if you can get the additional mana, because you can't get mana leech because you don't do any physical damage, if you can get additional mana and mana regen, try and slip it in where you can. It just makes things a bit comfy. I've not actually ran out of mana. The only time I've struggled with mana was during ultimatums, where it would be like, you have no more flask charges, you have no more mana, or you have 50% reduced recovery rate and stuff like that. So if you see any modifiers like that, avoid, because it does make things slow, because you are then arbitrarily waiting for your mana pool to refill up. But otherwise, everything dies in 1 or 2 shots, so you don't have to worry. You drop, you move, and in the time that you've moved from one screen to the next, you've usually recovered that mana anyway. And then you just pop the potion in between fights where you're dropping loads of grenades for rares or bosses, for example. 1 mana potion has pretty much covered me through everything, so you don't have to worry about that. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the Titan Grenadier. Like I said, really comfy build. It's probably the comfiest one I've played. I've had an Ice Monk that destroys the planet. I've had the fiery Fireball Deadeye, which also destroys the planet. But the tankiness of the Titan and just being able to stun everything, guaranteed on the first hit pretty much, it's just so nice. You can literally just drop grenades, run, and then leave death in your wake. It's just such a nice playstyle. As I said, it's not going to have the highest DPS on the planet. There are some builds that are just straight up broken that will exceed it. But that's not what this build's about. It's about having a laugh. It's about having fun. And it is a very, very fun build. And like I said, you get Bob. He goes with you wherever you go. If you like this guide, you should perhaps consider subscribing, because my next one is going to be a melee sorceress, a storm chaser to be exact, using Archmage and cast on crit. It's a work in progress, but a devastating one, I have no doubt. If you like the guide, like it. If you want to subscribe, you should. You can also follow me on Twitch, twitch.tv/Brian the Pirate, as well as joining my Discord, where you'll have access to my loot filter, Sidekick application I use for price checking, also Slim Trade, an application I use for better facilitating trades and things like that. Oh, that's really helpful. Thank you all very much for watching. Farewell, Merry Christmas, and I'll remember you.